Okay, so just to briefly go over that for anybody who missed it, this is the Rewilding the Curriculum workshop, and what we're going to do first of all is introduce the idea of rewilding as a conservation strategy, and then we're going to do some group work in a little bit where we look at integrating examples from rewilding projects into the ecology curriculum. So if we go to the next slide, Naina, that's all right. Okay, so I think an important question to ask is, are we in crisis in the UK? Often we see documentaries which are looking at the melting of the polar ice caps and deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, but we don't often appreciate what's happening on our own doorstep. And one report which puts together what's happening in Britain really nicely is the State of Nature report, which came out in 2019. So that's a report which looks at, collects data from the government, from universities, and from environmental agencies since 1970. So they've been collecting data for 50 years, and they're looking at biodiversity and the state of the land and what we're using the land for in the UK over this amount of time. And loads of things came out of this report. It's really extensive, but just to pick out some of the key points, I think something that really shocked me was that since 1970, almost half of all of the species which are endemic to the UK, so 41%, have seen a decrease in their populations. And not only a decrease, but now we see those species in less places around the UK. So they're becoming more and more refined to certain hotspots rather than widespread like they used to be. And obviously it's disproportionate how it affects different species. So some species are being really hard hit, like certain species of butterflies and moths. And then we're seeing increases in species that we might not want, such as aphid increases, which is obviously going to have a really bad effect on agriculture. And it's sort of shocking how we use our land as well in the UK. So I didn't realise, but 72% of our land is used for agriculture, which is something that is beneficial for us, but not necessarily for biodiversity and for sort of sustaining these species. And we have a lot of woods in the UK. 13% of our land is woodland, but only just less than half of that is sustainable woodland, which is woodland, again, which supports good biodiversity. And it's not just terrestrial, this extends into our freshwater systems and into the seas. Only half of our fisheries are sustainable, and this is having an effect on our water habitats as well. So yeah, the crisis is very much on our doorstep. So I think I'm ready for the next slide. So what can we do to, as an antidote for all of this doom and gloom, basically? And what is happening across Britain in a lot of different places is this conservation strategy called rewilding. And just for a definition, it's the process of protecting an environment and returning it to its natural state. And I think it's an interesting idea, because what it's doing really is looking at not just what the environment was like perhaps 200 years ago before the Industrial Revolution, but it's looking at what the environment was like many millennia ago before the Agricultural Revolution. So actually, what did our forests and grasslands look like before we were even here? And one way in which rewilding conservationists are sort of implementing this strategy is by bringing back wild animals which have been extinct, which inhabit a certain niche in the ecosystem. And just to say, rewilding runs directly counter to attempts by humans to control nature. So it's counter to agriculture, it's counter to ranches, it's counter to damming our waterways, etc. So I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so just a little bit of background and sort of the origins of rewilding. As I said, it's sort of resetting the baseline from not pre-industrial but pre-agriculture, and at once, sort of in the last few decades, individually different groups of conservationists sort of came to the conclusion that we need to look further back. And I've just used 3 of the pioneering examples here of rewilding. So one that you might have heard of is Yellowstone National Park, where they brought back the wolves. And this sort of happened in the mid-1990s. And bringing back the wolves has had such a dramatic effect on the ecosystem there. It means that it's changed the way the land is, it's changed the way the waters are, it's brought other species back to the national park, which weren't seen for many years. And a little bit before that, in the Netherlands, there's another initiative called Oostvaardersplassen, which is just 20 miles outside of Amsterdam. And this was a sort of initiative which was set up on a disused industrial land, and they've brought back herbivores to the land, and they've just allowed the land to be grazed and sort of for nature to restore itself. And what they found, what scientists found, was that they'd then get other species, bird species, come in and fulfill in niches which have long not been fulfilled, and that would actually extend into the surrounding environment as well and have a knock-on effect even wider than the reserve. And perhaps the most exciting rewilding project, which is still very much an experiment, is this one called Pleistocene Park, which is happening in Siberia in the Arctic Circle. And what they're attempting to do here is really ambitious, but it's really exciting. They're actually hoping to bring back the woolly mammoth ecosystem by returning the environment to a grassland environment. And they're doing this by bringing back lots of herbivores, and they think that by bringing back these animals they can actually mitigate the effects of climate change, which is just fantastic. And what they want to do eventually, they're working with de-extinction scientists to actually try to bring back extinct species. So I think I read one article which said that they're hoping to have a woolly mammoth in the park within the decade. So I don't know whether that's feasible or not, but it's definitely something to be excited about. So that's just a little bit of background on rewilding, and I think I'll hand over to Naina now, who's going to carry on the presentation.
Thanks very much, Lucy. That's absolutely fantastic. I mean, the actual definition of rewilding is so very important, and we will obviously touch on that right the way through the workshop. But the key reason why we're putting this workshop together is obviously we're talking about teachers using some really concrete examples of things that are going on. And rewilding is, one of those things that perhaps we need to actually share with young people in school, so they can actually see, what the consequences are when we do something like this within nature. Talking about rewilding, what rewilding is doing is it's emphasizing the preservation of natural ecosystems, and we're making efforts to repair ecosystems that have been damaged basically by human activity. Rewilding proposes that people take really a proactive approach to assisting natural ecosystems to retain their former diversity, as Lucy was talking about, all those animals and plants that were roaming there before we had our influence on that land. That abundance seems to be disappearing fast, and Kevin talked about that, and Lucy's talked about that as well in some detail. So our land encroachment, we are the dominant species on the planet at the moment, and we are having a devastating effect on the planet. And that's why we really need to start thinking about taking nature back to its original state, because the balance has been affected. So what rewilding is proposing is letting nature refine its own balance, in many ways letting the land turn back into its feral state, if you like, so that nature itself can work out what's best for it, basically. Rewilding is about making a whole wilderness ecosystem truly wild, and making it self-sustaining, abundant and diverse. So to me, one of the most important things, and Lucy talked about this, is bringing back that biodiversity. We've lost so much of our biodiversity. So we want to increase the diversity, bring back those numbers of organisms, because that will address the balance that we seem to be in a lot of our environmental ecosystems. So Gerry, I wonder if you could pull up that video, because I think this 5-minute video will probably encapsulate what we want to see in terms of rewilding, and projects like Lucy's mentioned are taking advantage of this, and there's a key thing that it talks about in the video, and that is about putting really the large herbivores and carnivores, that they call them the apex consumers, back into the oh yeah, thanks Gerry, back into the ecosystems that we're talking about.
But long after they went extinct, great beasts we call the megafauna lived on every continent. In the Americas, ground sloths the size of elephants pulled down trees with their claws. Saber-toothed cats the size of brown bears hunted in packs, but they were no match for short-faced bears which stood 13 feet on their hind legs and are likely to have driven these cats away from their prey. There were armadillos as big as small cars, an 8-foot beaver, and a bird with a 26-foot wingspan. Almost everywhere, the world's megafauna were driven to extinction, often by human hunters. Some species still survive in parts of Africa and Asia. In other places, you can still see the legacy of these great beasts. Most trees are able to re-sprout where their trunk is broken, to withstand the loss of much of their bark, and to survive splitting, twisting and trampling, partly because they evolved to survive attacks by elephants. The American pronghorn can run so fast because it evolved to escape the American cheetah. The surviving animals live in ghost ecosystems, adapted to threats from species that no longer exist. Today, it may be possible to resurrect those ghosts, to bring back lost species using genetic material. For instance, there's been research into cloning woolly mammoths from frozen remains. But even if it's not possible, we can still restore many of the ecosystems the world has lost. How? By making use of abandoned farms. As the market for food is globalized, infertile land becomes uncompetitive. Farmers in barren places can't compete with people growing crops on better land elsewhere. As a result, farming has started to retreat from many regions, and trees have started to return. One estimate claims that 2/3 of land in the US that was once forested but was cleared for farming has become forested again. Another estimate suggests that by 2030, an area in Europe the size of Poland will be vacated by farmers. So even if we can't use DNA to bring back ground sloths and giant armadillos, we can restore bears, wolves, pumas, lynx, moose and bison to the places where they used to live. Some of these animals can reshape their surroundings, creating conditions that allow other species to thrive. When wolves were reintroduced to the Yellowstone National Park in 1995, they quickly transformed the ecosystem. Where they reduced the numbers of overpopulated deer, vegetation began to recover. The height of some trees quintupled in just 6 years. As forests returned, so did songbirds. Beavers, which eat trees, multiplied in the rivers, and their dams provided homes for otters, muskrats, ducks, frogs and fish. The wolves killed coyotes, allowing rabbits and mice to increase, providing more food for hawks, weasels, foxes and badgers. Bald eagles and ravens fed on the carrion that the wolves abandoned. So did bears, which also ate the berries on the returning shrubs. Bison numbers rose as they browsed the revitalized forests. The wolves changed almost everything. This is an example of a trophic cascade, a change at the top of the food chain that tumbles all the way to the bottom, affecting every level. The discovery of widespread trophic cascades may be one of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century. They tell us that ecosystems that have lost just 1 or 2 species of large animals can behave in radically different ways from those that retain them. All over the world, new movements are trying to catalyze the restoration of nature in a process called rewilding. This means undoing some of the damage we've caused, re-establishing species which have been driven out, and then stepping back. There is no attempt to create an ideal ecosystem, To produce a heath, a rainforest, or a coral reef, rewilding is about bringing back the species that drive dynamic processes and then letting nature take its course. But it's essential that rewilding must never be used as an excuse to push people off the land. It should happen only with the consent and enthusiasm of the people who work there. Imagine standing on a cliff in England, watching sperm whales attacking shoals of herring as they did within sight of the shore until the 18th century. By creating marine reserves in which no commercial fishing takes place, that can happen again. Imagine a European Serengeti full of the animals that used to live there: hippos, rhinos, elephants, hyenas and lions. What rewilding reintroduces, alongside the missing animals and plants, is that rare species called hope. It tells us that ecological change need not always proceed in the same direction. The silent spring could be followed by a wild summer.
If you just go back to our slides. So you can see the general picture there of, you know, the rewilding model and how biodiversity can be encouraged to return to its original state. One of the things, obviously, that's been caught up in the news is COVID-19 recently. We've seen all the events, and they're saying that actually reducing the balance may have caused the pandemic. I mean, if we got rid of the apex organisms, then the ones right at the bottom may have thrived, like mice and bats. And of course, that is connected to COVID-19. So perhaps reducing the balance in ecosystems may cause further pandemics. So it's something that's quite serious, and we do need to look at it very, very carefully, don't we? Let me just go back to our slides. So I was focusing on increasing the diversity and number of organisms by using this model of rewilding, trying to reverse those human changes and creating that self-sustaining environment within our ecosystems, readdressing the balance. That's what rewilding really looks at as a model. So when we look at the theory that's connected on the curriculum within schools, that we obviously talk about ecology, we talk about all of those key things: biodiversity, climate change, ecosystems, human impact on ecosystems. And what this workshop is about is trying to connect all of that theory to concrete examples that young people can appreciate and can see as real examples in the real world. And they need those, and we're hoping that we'll be able to show you how to do that through the workshop today. So what causes unstable ecosystems? We just need to draw our attention to that, don't we, a little bit? And that's already been mentioned by Lucy and in the video as well. It's the killing of those large animals, those herbivores that graze and trample to create those mosaics of habitats. And the cascading addresses that within the rewilding model. Human management, of course, that Lucy mentioned, you know, agriculture, deforestation, fishing, urbanization, all of those have had a major impact. And then, of course, there's extreme weather conditions, which are related to that carbon increase in the world as well. So there are lots of examples of rewilding. I mean, 4 different types of rewilding, really. Trophic rewilding, which is restoring the big wilderness areas based on that regulatory role of the large predators, like the Yellowstone Park that Lucy was talking about. Then she gave you an example of the Plasticine rewilding, and those are efforts to restore that evolutionary and ecological potential of ecosystems, which were lost through the demise of megafauna, if you like, 10, 15,000 years ago, through the introduction of relatives or functional equivalents of extinct species. So Lucy was talking about the mammoth returning, and in reality, it's an Asian elephant with mammoth-like traits. It's a relative that's being reintroduced. And then you've got translocation rewilding. These are all technical terms, but you'll see these in action in the examples that we use in a minute. And that's taking actions to restore dysfunctional ecological processes via species reintroduction. So, you know, introducing the giant tortoise back into its environment, or, you know, the giant anteaters that have been lost to the environment, tapirs, jaguars, that sort of thing. There's a project in Argentina, for example, called Ibera, which is trying to do that. And then there's the passive rewilding. I mean, this one is the one that connects most with me. I mean, Gerry's going to talk to you about Nape estate in West Sussex, which used to be a working farm, you know, a picture postcard of how English countryside should look: green fields, manicured hedgerows, ditches, land that was constantly active with maize, barley, rye, but it was basically a biological desert. The biodiversity was lacking. And now it's looking much more like Africa. So I'm going to let Gerry take over now, because he's going to introduce you to what we're going to be doing in terms of the rewilding and the curriculum. Gerry, you're on mute.
Right. Hi. This next slide gives you a few links that you can follow up at a later time to show you what's happening in the country. But as Naina said, one of the interesting pioneering projects in the country is down in West Sussex. NEP, that's KNEPP, NEP Castle Estate, that's run by an ecologist and a rewilding expert now, called Isabella Tree, and her husband Charles Burrell. And they had this farm on the heavy clay of the Weald that was not really very productive, and it was marginal. And talking to people involved in the Dutch project, they decided to rewild their farm, which is about 3,500 acres. And they removed fences, they added some free roaming livestock, some pigs, wild boar, and cattle. And that they found that very quickly the soil was recovering, the species diversity was increasing, and although there were still limitations, there are still roads around the farm, and you can't allow the cattle to die naturally because of legislation. There are enormous gains, and if you use the rare species as indicators, things like turtle doves, nightingales, purple emperor butterflies, peregrine falcons, lesser redpolls, cuckoos, great white egrets, these all came back in increasing numbers. And in this country, we've got about 17 species of bats, and 13 of them started taking up residence on the farm. And this last summer has been a notable first, because there's a project to introduce white storks, and the first white storks to have been bred in the UK occurred on the NEP Castle estate, the first for several hundred years. So there's some wonderfully interesting ongoing projects, relevant projects, things that could bloom and expand to bigger things still going on. And if we can go on to the next slide, Naina, please. This is where you come in your teaching, because wouldn't it be wonderful if you could use such fascinating contemporary ideas as a basis for your ecology teaching? And it's facilitated by the fact that all GCSE specifications are written in a very genetic generic form. The chief examiners deliberately say, right, well, we're not going to specify which habitats you look at or which food chains or which food webs. We're not going to specify which examples of the effect of humans you're going to look at, because people live in different towns and countryside, and they've got access to different types of habitat. So let the teachers choose. So you've got this freedom to mold your teaching to fit in with this very generic specification. So the bottom bullet point there, why not choose an example of rewilding to illustrate critical issues of nature crisis and address the specification at the same time? It makes sense. It may not enable you to teach the whole ecology section on the basis of rewilding examples, but wouldn't it be nice to bring one of them in to help contribute to that ecology teaching? Naina, if we can go on to the next one. Thank you. Here's all the key ideas from the AQA Triple Award Science Specification. So you see that you've got lots of scientific terminology there: classification of ecosystems, communities, competition, habitats. And you could choose one rewilding example, and you could address probably a third of those at least. With some examples, you could probably pick up on more of those. If you're talking about the Yellowstone Park example, there's some wonderful examples there of food chains and webs and producers and consumers, and examples of interdependence and competition. So different rewilding examples will address different specification key points. Okay, and the next one, please, Naina. Thank you. So this is what we're going to ask you to do, and we're going to put you into breakout rooms in, I think it's going to be groups of 6, because we've got about 36 people involved. And we're going to ask you to have a look at the rewilding fact sheets in the folder, and Naina has put a link in the chat to the folder with all these documents in. And in that folder, you'll see 6 rewilding fact sheets, one for each different habitat. So there's Yellowstone, there's Pleistocene Park, there's NEP, there's one local to us in Derbyshire at Thornhill Car. There's the wonderful project that was covered by Spring Watch and Autumn Watch last year about the Cairngorm National Forest area and the Scottish Highlands. So as a group, we'll ask you, number 1, to choose a rewilding fact sheet, then discuss within your group how you could use that to meet the specifications. And in the folder, you also find a pro forma document where you can write all your ideas. And we want you to come up with some imaginative and creative ideas and how you could make links to different parts of the specification. Could you use drama? Could you use discussion? Could you use the fact sheets themselves? Could you create a board game? All sorts of different ideas could come in there, and then you can make the links across from the block where you're writing across to the section of the specification.
So, Gerry, I think there's a couple of groups that have made some big dents into those performer sheets. Shall we have a look at the two groups that have made those big dents?
Yeah, the group that was working on the Scottish Highlands, would there be a spokesperson from that group to summarize some of their ideas? Because you've got a lot of interesting links written down already on the sheet.
I can do that if you want.
Thank you, Courtney.
So we all kind of had a look at it, and we were looking at different things. So we'd all thought we'd look at, different factors so that we could all fit in, because we're different things. So someone did about the biotic factors and the abiotic factors. So the things that we need to think about before you can think about what you need for adaptations, because if the adaptation, they need a specific like temperature or amount of rainfall, they need a certain amount of sunlight, and you've got like a dense area of trees, or if they need like a lot of sunlight, if no sunlight and you've got just this empty grassland, then they can't survive. And so you have to link like the abiotic and the biotic factors to the adaptations they need. And then so the levels of organization with the food chain, we thought you could link to a lot of things. So they have an overpopulation of deer due to the loss of their apex predators. So when you think about how this overpopulation affects the environmental conditions, which is back to your abiotic and your biotic factors, it impacts the biodiversity in the area, because if the deer are overgrazing and they're limiting the regeneration of it, because there's just so many of them, because they're not being controlled, it's unsustainable. And so it leads to undiverse areas, because you end up losing habitats, and then things such as the sea eagle, which left, you've now lost, and you can't get it back because you've not got the conditions that it needs to survive. And so you need to reduce it to a suitable level, at which point you can then reintroduce the other apex predators, because you can hopefully, when you've reduced that to a certain level, get back the conditions they need, and then you can hopefully get this balance of the food chain once again, so that things are surviving. And so we also did about how you could do a debate with students with the biodiversity, so you could get them to research examples of when introduction hasn't worked and when it has worked. And you can get them to like the cane toads in Australia, and you can have a class debate about whether rewilding is a good thing or a negative thing, and whether you need to, like certain things, you can mitigate the risks. So somebody in our group was saying that as part of their degree, they were looking about introducing some apex predators back in, and there's like very specific areas that you can introduce them in. So you can ask pupils like why you need specific things like that, and you can do a debate with them. And so we just did things like that, and how the introduction of things, it all kind of links, because to maintain biodiversity, you need these abiotic factors, you need the food chain to be balanced, and you need like the restoration to all be sustainable.
Right, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Another group that I went into, group 2, were discussing some of these ethical issues as well, and talking about Diamond 9 exercises and debates, trying to look at some of these issues, which was great. So thank you very much for that. The other group, the one that Naina dropped into, looking at Yellowstone Park, is there a spokesperson from the Yellowstone Park group that would like to talk?
Yeah, I don't mind talking.
Okay, thank you, Meg.
Yeah, so we did Yellowstone, and me and Guy, being zoologists, were saying this is pretty much the staple example for reintroduction. So there's quite a lot of resources on it, especially on YouTube. There's loads of like little documentaries and stuff. So we were saying it would be nice to use that as an intro to reintroducing species, so that they can understand food chains more. I've got a list: ecosystems, community, competition, habitats. It's pretty much covering it all. And then using a debate, kind of like what Courtney said with her example, getting the class to debate to whether introducing wolves in the UK would possibly work, or debating and comparing it to another UK example and how that's different. So talking about the wolves, its impact on ecotourism, what species would be affected. So that's going back to the food chain, having to think about the different species we have here in the UK that are different to the US, and how that would affect that, and the environmental change. And yeah, like Guy said as well, if this was a thing that happened in the UK with wolves being introduced, it would be something that had to be debated and spoken about and researched involved. So getting the kids to do that as well is important, because that is what happens in the real world.
That is very exciting, Meg. That is absolutely fantastic. I mean, if we could get some of these things going on in the classroom, and then, you know, just coming back to some of these resources and adding a little bit more detail, I think this would be worth circulating to somebody like the ASE, who perhaps could then circulate this further to all teachers within schools, so that they've got a resource bank where concrete examples have been used to see the impact on the environment. Gerry, is there anything else that you want to say as a closing statement? Because we're actually running a little bit over time now. I just wanted to draw their attention to some of the lunchtime activities that are going on.
Just to say that there's quite a lot of resources in that folder, which hopefully you'll all be able to get access to. If you've got the link, hopefully you'll be able to get into it. If not, we'll try and put it onto another link somehow. So hopefully you'll be able to use that further and perhaps develop your own ideas from it. So that would be good. Okay.